Good afternoon. My name is Brian K. Smith. I'm joined by my colleague, Jonathon Allen, chair of our history department. And today we're thrilled to welcome our two guests to have a great conversation about the National Chicano Moratorium and the March on Washington against the Vietnam War and the March against the Vietnam War. Joining us today are Dr. Marne L. Campbell, who is an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University in the Department of African American Studies. She earned her PhD in history at UCLA. She also has a master's degree from the Interdepartmental Program in Afro-American Studies. And her undergraduate degrees are in history and Afro-American studies, also from UCLA. Our other panelist today is Dr. Ernesto Chavez, whose work intersects Chicano and Latino borderlands in history. He examines the history of American Southwest, focusing on the matrix of race, class, and sexuality throughout the entire Mexican and Latino American past. Also a graduate of UCLA with a bachelor's, master's, and PhD from that institution. Welcome both of our panelists today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, BK. I'd first just like to mark this moment in time as we're about to embark on a discussion of demonstrations for social justice. In this final week of August 2020, we see yet another explosion of racial tension in Kenosha, Wisconsin, after a Black man was shot 7 times in the back by a white police officer. And within the past 24 hours, we've learned that a white 17-year-old with a military-style semi-automatic rifle who did not live in Wisconsin murdered 2 people in Kenosha. So that's just to contextualize what's happening this week, just as we're about to commemorate 2 historic protest movements. The 50th anniversary of the Chicano Moratorium March on Saturday, and the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which we're commemorating tomorrow. All of this is amidst the current backdrop of what may be the largest movement in US history. And of course, I'm referring to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I just can't imagine a more relevant time to both commemorate these 2 events and to make important connections between the past and the present. So first and foremost, thank you both for being willing to join us and to have this conversation. So thank you again. Before we get into the actual events, I do want to make an important point of terminology, to clarify terminology. To make sure all of our viewers are on the same page, particularly since we'll be discussing at length the Chicano Moratorium. Dr. Chavez, could you please clarify what the term Chicano or Chicana means and how it differs from Latino, Latina, or Latinx or Hispanic?
Sure. So Chicano and Chicana, and some people use Chicanx also, is a term that came about in the 1960s, and it was really a politicized Mexican American. Mexican Americans in the 1960s said, we are neither Mexican nor American. We're kind of in between. We're a new entity. And also, back then, Mexican American was used with a hyphen, and they said, we don't want to be hyphenated Americans. We don't want to be known as second-class citizens, basically. And so it's, for the most part, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx has to do with, is usually Mexican American based. But in some ways, you could become a Chicano or Chicana, right? It was a transformative kind of identity in some ways. I have a student whose family's from Colombia, and she considers herself Chicana, right? She, among her many different kind of identities, she considers herself a Chicana also. Latino, Latina, Latinx, once again, is a term that comes about, really, the first time that it was used was in the 1940s. And then in some ways, there's an opposition to using Mexican in places like Texas, because Mexican was such a bad word for some people. It had these connotations. But then it really takes off in the 70s and really the 80s because of the diaspora from Central America and other Latin American countries, especially in a place like Los Angeles, right? And so then it's a kind of a pan-ethnicity that is there to bring people together, right? So, if you talk about people in Los Angeles that are from Latin America, they're not just from Mexico, they're from lots of different places. So it's best to use this umbrella term of Latino, which is male, right? Or Latina, which is female, or Latinx, which is gender neutral, which people are using more and more. And then when it comes to Hispanic, Hispanic is a term that was really popularized by the US government in the 1980 census. And so it becomes a kind of, word of officialdom, not to say that, people don't use Hispanic as a kind of self-reference. What I usually say, like here in where I teach in El Paso, what I usually say is that people are publicly Hispanic because it's a very kind of a popular term among people here in El Paso to distinguish themselves from, let's say, people from Juarez, which is right across the border. It's, like less than 2 miles away from where I live. And privately, they're Mexican in some ways, or at home, they're Mexican. So I think that, kind of captures it, right? It's a kind of public identity of officialdom in some ways.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Let's just jump right into it. For our audience who may have never heard of the National Chicano Moratorium March that took place right here in Los Angeles, at least right here, can you set the scene for us? What was happening in 1970 and what conditions led to the march in East LA?
So the march in the Chicano Moratorium March was a protest against the Vietnam War. And it was calling to end the Vietnam War, like many other protests against the Vietnam War during this time. But what really was driving it was the fact that Latinos, mostly Mexican Americans, were dying in higher proportion to the rest of the population. And this was also the same thing for African Americans, but this was a Chicano group. So they centered on this, right? And so what happens is not only was that going on, where people were dying in disproportionate numbers, but they were being drafted also because they went to substandard schools and they didn't go to college, and so they couldn't get college deferments. The other thing too, that there was widespread poverty in these neighborhoods, lack of representation also in city government and then county government, and then also there was police brutality during that time. And so people said to themselves, so we live in these conditions, we're dying for America, but America is not really working for us. And so then what happens is that a group of young people organized this march on August 29th, 1970. It was the third of several marches. So, and then there was going to be another one later on. But what happens is people march to the streets of East Los Angeles. We think that it's between 20,000 to 30,000 people that march to the streets of East Los Angeles to protest against the war. And at the end of the march down Whittier Boulevard, they go to a place called Laguna Park. There's a peaceful rally. And what happens is that there's, under the pretext of a disruption of a crime being committed on Whittier Boulevard, the LA sheriffs come in and they break up the rally and they beat people indiscriminately. And it turns into what, was known as a riot, basically. So that's what basically happens on that day.
Thank you.
Dr. Campbell, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963, similar vein, similar ambiance. Could you give us a historical background?
Yeah. So much like today, there was an overwhelming amount of injustice that Black people were responding to. Back then, however, people were fighting for things like voting rights, not that we're not now, basic civil and human rights, fair employment, just essential rights guaranteed by the Constitution that, in fact, were guaranteed about 100 years prior to the march. And so people had been organizing and protesting in other kinds of ways, but this march really marked the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so this was a chance for African Americans to really confront the nation about the lack of progress over those 100 years. And, in that time, all of the promises that were made, as I said, guaranteed by the Constitution, basic fairness had not given to Black people. So whereas you may have rights on paper, they weren't put into practice. And so, we often forget, I think, that this was not like just a random march on Washington. There had been precedents in the past, and there had also been precedents of really pushing the president and the government to act sometimes without having to do a march. But in this case, it was to get as many people as possible with all of the dedication they had to come together on a very hot day, you know, in the summertime, to really confront the nation, and to also to remember that this was a march. The March on Washington was also March on Washington for jobs and freedom, right? And I think that sort of says it a lot, and it says it all in a nutshell. But the organizers of the protest knew that this was going to be the thing that would really kind of force the country into really looking at itself and making a decision about how it would handle and deal with its own, to put it very lightly, unfairness and poor treatment of African Americans.
That's great. I mean, both of these historical events, the Chicano Moratorium, 50 years now, you know, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, 57 years old now. We are still talking about them. We are still marching for various and sundry things. In your opinions, why are we still having these conversations? Why do we still have to do this?
Ernie?
I think that what happens, well, first of all, I think that we remember what I failed to mention earlier is one of the reasons we remember the Chicano Moratorium is because one of the things that happens is 3 people are killed there. Ruben Salazar is one of them, and he was a reporter for the LA Times, and he was also the news director for KMEX, the only Spanish language television station at the time. And then another man by the name of Gilberto Diaz, and then a teenager, Lynn Ward, was also killed on that day. But Salazar was killed when they fired a tear gas projectile into the bar that he was in, that he had ducked into to escape the melee. And he's hit on the head and he dies because of that. And so I think that what happens is that, you know, people, the march is then transformed, or the event and the organization is then transformed into a group that's against police brutality, because Salazar was the ultimate victim of police brutality in the minds of these activists. And so I think that what happens is, you know, we remember it because of the amount of people that marched through the streets of East Los Angeles during that time. That number, that was the largest number of people until 2006, when something like 1 to 2 million people marched to the streets of downtown Los Angeles to call for immigration reform. And so remember it because of the numbers. But then what happens also then, of course, is that, as you said in your opening, right, we still have police brutality. The other thing that's going on that, you know, we should not lose sight of is that coronavirus has affected African Americans and Latinos at a disproportionate number. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because they are essential workers, right? And they are working those low-paying jobs where they have to come in regardless of whether they're sick or not, right? So it seems to me that one of the things that goes on then is that these marches, both the March on Washington and the Chicano Moratorium, in some ways are trying to make, as I said before, about what, you know, these organizers didn't think was going on. They're trying to make America work for them, right? And I think that we can really see that in, you know, the March on Washington, and trying to make sure that those constitutional rights that were guaranteed to people 100 years before are going to be achieved, right? And so I think that, you know, I don't think we're there yet, right? And I think that in some ways, you know, as I see it, these events then, you know, really make sense, right? And they really show us a kind of mode to try to change things in America, given what's going on today in this very moment.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead, Dr. Campbell.
I would just add to that. I mean, you know, Dr. Chavez said everything that I wanted to say anyway, so that I'm happy that he's mentioned these things, but I also want to kind of talk a little bit about the point he made about the essential workers, because when you're an essential worker, or what we consider today essential workers, those are the jobs where the people are the least insured, underinsured, right? So medical attention, getting to a doctor when you need to, if you have some symptoms and things like that. Things are not covered like they are for those people who are the most insured and who have the most money, and also the most time to take off of work to go and seek seek help when you need it. But also when COVID-19 first began here in the United States, a lot of companies laid people off, furloughed people, and so those were essential workers, right? Most of those people were essential workers and may have lost benefits or may not have had benefits to begin with. And so at the end of the day, they are also the people who are most in need right now of basic universal health care, right? And so what we see as a result of that are a lot more people who are Black and who are brown, who are sick and dying from this virus because they can't get the care and attention that they need. And that's something I just didn't want to go overlook.
Sure. And Dr. Campbell, you mentioned this in your opening. You talked about how the March on Washington, which took place in 1963, was a march for jobs and for freedom. Mm-hmm. We're still marching today. It has morphed into, and you sort of alluded to the Voting Rights Act. It's morphed into so many different things as we've moved in and as we've moved along and where we are today. Can you talk a little bit about what the significance of that and how it continues to move?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I said earlier was about having rights on paper is not having rights, and is not the same as having rights in practice. Mm-hmm. And so, that means that your voices are still going unheard politically, that you're not getting the representation that you should have. And I mean, we can talk another day about how people feel about political representation altogether. But when people faced gerrymandered districts where representatives were not the representatives of the particular community that they actually represented, but they were just people who were able to use gerrymandering as a way to get into public office. And it's not even at the national level, it's also at the local level, being able to have the people in office to protect your community, whether that means providing, just basics like maintaining the streets, maintaining parks, if there are parks in your community, protecting neighborhoods, maintaining trash and sanitation, and just basic things, instead of being forced into situations where you just can't take advantage of what other people in other neighborhoods can. And we see this very clearly today, especially when people are sort of talking about quote unquote urban life compared to suburban life, and kind of starting. I'm trying to be very careful about how I say this. Starting
say it.
So just out and out, sort of being divisive amongst those who have and those who don't, mm-hmm. right? So the people who live in the suburbs in most states in the country, who are predominantly white and middle class, compared to those who live in the cities and in urban communities, who are predominantly people of color and working class, right? And so those are the people who are now forced to, again, confront the nation and try to help point out to this nation where the discrepancies are, how they're not being treated the same. I mean, if the president of an entire country tells people who live in a very particular kind of neighborhood, you got to watch out for these people, that is extremely problematic. People from this neighborhood are going to take over these neighborhoods. And, I mean, we know these are old tricks. We know they've happened before. We know that they've been used at various points in our history by different groups of people, from, real estate agents, from, city councils and all of these kinds of things to really scare people from, engaging in people from other places and other backgrounds. And so it's really shameful, and it's sad that Black and brown people now have to, again, get out there in the forefront and show this country that we've not healed from the problems of the past. We've not healed from slavery. There's been no reconciliation. There's been no, real effort by our government to really address the problems of this nation. And these are problems that, that were started when the nation started, right? This nation is founded on a lot of this. This nation is founded on racism. It's founded on capitalism. It's, all of the issues that we're seeing now are the same issues. They're being played out in different kinds of ways, but they're the same issues at the end of the day. And that, to me, is the bigger problem. So we put things on paper, but we don't put them into practice. And until we do that, I think we're never going to get out of this cycle.
And also, I would just like to add that the other thing too is that we shouldn't look at, there's a tendency sometimes for people to think about like, how things are getting better over time, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily the case, right? That doesn't always happen, right? And it depends on, what communities we're talking about, right? So I think that the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots is something that's been going on over something like 40 years or something, right? And so it's something for us to think about, especially, as historians, right? That, we look at the past and then we think, like, oh, like there's progress. And then, well, that's just not the case, right? Sometimes you kind of go, I don't want to say you go back, but you kind of like, like it doesn't mean that there's progress over time, basically.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. I mean, as educators who focus on history and who kind of cultivate among our students these historical thinking skills like change and continuity or similarities and differences, I mean, this topic alone is fascinating because we really get to evaluate all that. I want to take it back to the two historical events themselves and talk about leadership. The March on Washington had clear leadership in the Big Six, among them Philip Randolph, who saw this march as a lifelong dream, and the younger Martin Luther King Jr. and the late, great John Lewis, who just recently passed in July of this year. In contrast, one of the main sparks of the Chicano Moratorium March and the movement as a whole were the high school walkouts of 1968, instigated and led mostly by teenagers. So how would you compare the role of age and class for both marches? And would it be fair to characterize the March on Washington as shaped more by established middle-class figures versus the Chicano Moratorium as more youthful and working class? Would that be somewhat accurate?
Yeah, I think that definitely the March on Washington is, organized by these, as you just said, Philip Randolph, and then these younger activists. The Chicano movement, the Chicano Moratorium, and the Chicano movement per se is young people. But when we look at the Chicano Moratorium, the organizers are actually not high school students, but they were college students. They were college graduates. They had just graduated. Rosalio Munoz, who was the main organizer, along with Cesar Noriega, they met at UCLA, and Rosalio Munoz was the first student body president, first Mexican-American student body president at UCLA in like 1969 or so. And he himself, actually, it's very interesting because he comes from a middle-class family, actually, and his father's family is very middle-class. his uncle by marriage had been a leader in the 1940s in a group called the Mexican American Movement. And so, they're middle class and they're also working class and they're also high school students that join in also, right? But then it's also lots of other people because they're also getting support from Edward Roybal, for instance, who was a congressman and former city councilman for Los Angeles, the only Mexican American city councilman for a while. And then, he becomes a member of Congress in 1962. So there is, I think it runs the gamut. I think that the 68 blowouts definitely politicize people and they take action, but it's a kind of multi-generational group. And the parents in the 68 blowouts, as they were called, the walkouts were called blowouts, lots of parents are very much involved also, supporting their children. So I think that part of it is that there's these kind of multi-generational kind of coalitions, if you will, among Mexican Americans and Chicanos during this time, right? That they all see that, and I think that kind of points to the fact that they all see that there's something wrong with what's going on, right? What's exacerbating conditions during that time is the Vietnam War in 1970, right? That's what's really saying, that puts, things in perspective for people, right? And once again, right, to talk about the president, in some ways, I think that maybe we could see the same thing going on right now, right? That, like the coronavirus, right, that is another, event or it's a pandemic that's bringing about death, is also in some ways, exacerbating these conditions that already existed, right? So, I think it might be a good way of looking at it also, right?
I also think that when we look at the March on Washington, for whatever reason, whenever we look at the civil rights movement in general, we always think about like, oh, these are older, more established, activists. But Martin Luther King Jr. was very young. John Lewis was very young. A lot of them, most of them were young. Most of the protesters were, from middle school, high school, and college students. The March on Washington itself, though, was the people that came to the forefront, the people that you saw and heard speeches from were part of the more established groups of people, and a little bit older, definitely compared to the Chicano Moratorium, but also compared to other movements for civil rights that Black people engaged in. And we start to see the branching off of the youth, after this, a lot more youth and a lot more, a lot of younger people who started to really press for working class issues, even though this is, jobs and freedom. It still took these activists a little more time to get there, to really focus on those more working class African Americans and people. So I think that's also something to kind of consider. And then also to consider that, like today, when we're watching the news and we see these marches for Black Lives Matter, for example, we see people from every background, ethnicity, race, color, whichever way we want to describe it. And the March on Washington clearly represented a broader spectrum of people of different backgrounds than some of these other movements that were definitely more working class. And so for me, when I look at what's going on today, I just think, okay, we've got, everybody's on board. Everybody's clearly not on board, but like all of the groups of people are on board with this movement, and it will continue in one way or another. I think that's definitely a good place to work from.
That sounds optimistic.
Yeah, I know.
I want to throw this out there. The Chicano Moratorium has been described as one of the largest assemblages of Mexican Americans. Can you guys detail the primary resolve of these marches? I mean, what were the consequences of these marches and did they lead to real sustainable change? And then and now, as we look back now, 50 years later, could the Chicano Moratorium March have made more impact if it had been held, let's say, per se, Washington, D.C.?
I I um I don't think that it could have been held in Washington D.C. only because wouldn't have the numbers. Los Angeles is the largest Mexican city outside of Mexico City. Sometimes it's Guadalajara that has a larger number, but it's usually Los Angeles is the second largest Mexican city in the world. And so, you have that, right? And people came to or went to Los Angeles, and because they kind of saw it in some ways as the kind of Mexican American Mecca, the Chicano Mecca in some ways, right? And there were protests all around the country in different places like Colorado and in Texas, and even in New York, I think, that were organized by Mexican Americans, and then that's why this is called the National Chicano Moratorium, because it was going to take place, where lots of people from different places were going to go. As far as real change, I think that what happened is, I think that it was really hard to do during that time. And I think that in some ways, one has to think of the Chicano Moratorium as a step in trying to change things, right? That, people marched and people made people aware. And then what happened is that the authorities obviously broke this apart. And this was a devastating event for many people. The fact that they killed Ruben Salazar, who was like a voice for Mexican Americans during that time, right? He was the only person at the LA Times. For the longest time, the LA Times didn't have Mexican Americans working there in large numbers, right? They have a new, initiative to do that, right? That they just unveiled, last week and stuff. And so there was that, right? So the kind of powers to be the authorities. And one of the reasons why the authorities could do that is because there was little representation in government. There was nobody in there was no Latino member of the city council during that time, the LA City Council. There had been a vacuum of power there since 1962, when Edward Roybal became a member of Congress. There was no other Latino representative. There was nobody in the LA County Supervisor's office either, right? It wasn't until later on that you had redistricting, and these were court mandated redistricting efforts in the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles, that you reapportioned Los Angeles and the county, that you were able to then allow for representation in those places. Because the things that Dr. Campbell was talking about gerrymandering and all those other things that we think about going on only in the South, were going on in Los Angeles also, right? And so, one of the things that happens is that, you may not see, we know that, today, people are still living in poverty and are still these essential workers and have low paying jobs, right? But I think that what the Chicano Moratorium did was that it made people aware. It politicized a group of people. For example, Gilbert Cedillo, who is the representative for District 1 in Los Angeles, right now, LA City Council, was a Chicano activist in his youth, right? And then there's other people also, right, that, have come and gone from that. Antonio Villaraigosa, the mayor of Los Angeles, was a former activist also, right, who was maybe not at the moratorium, but he was at other marches and other Chicano movement groups, right? And then there was also a whole group of people that were able to go to college, finish college, and became lawyers and became professors and became other things. So, I don't think that the work is done yet, right? But I think that with anything, it's a process. And I think that it kind of, without the moratorium, I don't think you would have all those things that we have today, at least in the when it comes to representation, right? In city government and county government. Do we need more? Yes. Do we need more change? Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And you know, and I've said this earlier, right? There are tangible things that occurred from the March on Washington, and there are things that we see that we know occurred, that some days we celebrate and commemorate, and sometimes we're like, okay, but what's happened since then, right? So we had a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, 1965, employment protections and things like that. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people have reaped all of the benefits of what's on paper. And so we see that Black people still face high unemployment rates and unfair hiring, that we see Black people are still, and other people are still fighting for the right to vote, right? And we also see a sometimes slow peel, you know, like a repealing of those rights. And also we see it happen very quickly. And so you know, so there are some things that we can definitely point to, and we do all the time. You know, we say, "Oh, look, this happened, and it's so great," and blah blah. But then we have to say, "But where are we now?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? What
Mm-hmm.
happens after the March on Washington? Just in 2 years, Watts uprisings. And what is Watts uprising? What is the Watts uprising? You know, about? It's about police over policing of Black bodies, of Black people, right? And police brutality. And so we see that going on all over the country from 1965 forward, you know, through 1992, and then there's a lull, and now it's back, like it's back again, right? It's never really gone anywhere. If we were really to trace, you know, these bigger uprisings, when people say, yeah, of course we have these things, but we also don't have these things, you know. And so so I think that's also something to remember. So Ernie, you said this, Dr. Chavez, you said this earlier, like, you know, you move forward, but you also move backwards. Sometimes we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Sometimes we take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And I think over the last few years, at the very least, we're seeing that people are being just pushed now backwards. And so, you know, I probably am less optimistic about than what I've been saying, because it's also, I mean, it's so apparent right now that this is what's happening. It's the unraveling of all of these rights that people have fought to secure, and it's so crazy to me that it could just take a stroke of a pen to reverse all of this.
Dr. Campbell, you brought up several very good points, but I want to talk about one in particular that you mentioned. You know, I've you know, I studied as an undergrad in history. You know, I took a history class. I'm an English major. I'm an English teacher, but I've watched the videos as well. And you talked about police violence and brutality,
Mhm.
and you mentioned that, and you mentioned how it was prevalent then. It's even more prevalent now, you know, and this brutality has played a role in these 2 marches and does play a similar role in the protest we are currently seeing. Do you notice any similarities between what's happened, and Dr. Chavez, you can chime in as well, the Chicano Moratorium, the March on Washington, and the Black Lives Matter movement?
Oh, there are a lot of overlaps. And I think I do have to say that the Black Lives Matter movement it's received such a negative rap by mainstream society, right? That people have completely overlooked what it is that the Black Lives Matter movement actually does, what Black Lives Matter actually stands for, right? And so I think that that's really important. We see it arise out of violence and brutality against African Americans, and a lot of it by over policing of African Americans. And it's over policing by police forces, and it's over policing by individuals and groups of people who believe it's their job to protect and serve their communities, whatever they define that as. So I think when we really start to look at the things that Black Lives Matter is fighting for, it's the same stuff. Now it's updated, right? So there are protections that that Black Lives Matter would like to see for like Black LGBTQ communities, Black trans communities, and protections for Black trans women who are constantly violated by police and brutalized at the hands of police and things like that. So it's up, like there are things that they offer that they would have never offered in the 60s or probably even the 70s, but they're fighting for the same basic human right protections that we all should have as a citizen of the United States, as a member of United States, of the United States, as a person in the United States, as a human being. And so there are so many overlaps and so many things that if we all just had, we could eliminate half, not all, but half of these problems that we see.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's going on also is that what the Chicano Moratorium was saying, and I think that all of these social movements, these kind of, done that are organized by brown and Black people and others, right, other racialized groups, is that I think in the long run, what they're saying is that we're human too, right? And I think that, fundamentally, that's what Black Lives Matter is saying, right? We're human beings. And, and I think that that's something that, like when it comes right down to it, it's about humanity. It's about population, because I think that one of the things that, Chicano Moratorium was really concerned with was they basically called the Vietnam War a genocidal war. And they said, like they're trying to kill us, right? The government is trying to kill us. And it's not only that they're sending us to Vietnam, but they're also sending us, like even on the streets of LA, they're beating us up and they're killing us, right? And so I think that the notion of humanity is something that is, that ties all of this together, right? That, you want to be considered a full human being. And I think that, if we would all just get, if we would just all get on that kind of, on that page, I don't think that we would have these problems, right?
Thank you. I think that's one of the points that Jacob Black's mother was even trying to make just recently when she was talking about her son, right? Just that basic humanity. He was a human being.
Yes.
Thank you. I would want to talk about, I do have a quick question, is given our audience and given where BK and I work, how would you compare the role of women in each of these marches? It's fascinating to look at the emergence and growth of feminism during the 60s and 70s, working within the patriarchal structure, right? One of my colleagues reminded me that Black female organizers like Anna Hedgerman and Diane Nash, they were actually nudged to the side when it came to stage time for the March on Washington. But regarding the Chicano Moratorium, we see an emerging Chicana presence. So just to return to the question, how would you compare the role of women in both of these marches?
So, what happens is that the Chicano Moratorium Committee and the Chicano movement in general during that time was very much a male-dominated entity. And what's going to happen is, one of the groups that's organizing the Chicano Moratorium Committee or the moratorium itself, that's part of the moratorium committee, is the Brown Berets. And within the ranks of the Brown Berets, the women kind of break away earlier that year, actually, and they form a group called Las Adelitas de Aztlán, taking their name from the Adelitas were the women who would help the Mexican, that would be in the Mexican Revolution, basically. So they go back to history to take that name. And so, they're working in the office. They're doing, quote, women's work, basically, is what they're doing. And they're not up front and center. But in some ways, what happens is it once again, it raises your consciousness, right? And they break away and they form these different groups like Las Adelitas de Aslan. And in fact, the leader of that organization, whose name was Gloria Arellanes, was on the stage at the Chicano Moratorium when it was disrupted, right? And so, there is that. And they marched in the moratorium, right? They marched with their banner in the moratorium. And then the other group that's marched, once again, this is a kind of multiracial event. The other group that marched in the moratorium also was the Emma Lazarus Women's Group, Jewish Women's Group, marched under their banner during the moratorium, right? They came from, East Los Angeles, Boyle Heights was, traditionally a Jewish neighborhood. So some of them probably, had ties to Boyle Heights, right? But, they were there also. So, I think that they're not in the leadership because they're not being allowed to be in leadership, but they're supporting it. And then what happens is that their consciousness raised and they realize the sexism that's going on. And so then they, organize along those issues, right? Along those lines, eventually.
Yeah, and the March on Washington itself, we don't see a lot of women in the front of everything, right? We know that people kind of point to Mahalia Jackson, they point to Daisy Bates, and Daisy Bates was the only woman that was really allowed to give a speech. And this is after conversation and controversy over whether they were going to allow women, to say anything. But what we do know is that women were the foot soldiers and did a lot of the groundwork to get this thing, off the ground, right? Did a lot of that work. And so, this is one thing that I think is amazingly different from Black Lives Matter, being that it was founded by three women of color, and really just sort of got out there in the front of everything and said, okay, we need to organize, we need to do this, and through the use of social media and things like that, we're able to really kind of get that movement off the ground in ways that women were not so much allowed to back then. And I think also, as Dr. Chavez is talking about, women doing women's work and doing things like that, making sandwiches to feed the people and just different kinds of things. Though I don't condone it now as like that's what women should be doing. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that when you're looking at sort of gender relations and changes over time, it was just very different, particularly in this movement. We see a lot more female leadership, and some of it's through controversial means, but we see that in the Black Power movement more so than what we see. We do see a lot of women leadership, though, in the training of protesters during civil rights movements and helping to organize the sit-ins and different things like that. So women played a significant role. It's just that they were not invited to be a part of that role when it came time to deliver the speeches during the March on Washington.
I want to kind of sum this up and end our conversation here today, professors. I'd like to end with the great John Lewis, who at the time of the March on Washington was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at the age of 23, and who was mentored by Dr. King. He famously proclaimed, "Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." To what extent does that message still resonate with us today in 2020? And how might you suggest our students who are listening, who care about social injustice and inequality, partake in what Lewis called good trouble?
I think it's just as important now as it was then. I think that anyone who cares about social justice, anyone who cares about inequality, should be willing to engage in that, good trouble. I don't mind people engaging in the trouble that's not so good, to be honest with you, because it's necessary. But I do think that that more importantly, I think everyone has to understand that the struggle is real, that the struggle continues, right? And so it doesn't just end just because a law changed or a politician got into office or a pothole got filled. There's always more work to do, because until everyone is on the same level playing field, there's going to be work to do to make sure that everyone can, and I'll go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, until everyone is ensured basic human rights, and so we have to keep fighting, and there are all kinds of ways people can get involved. So they can get involved in the good trouble. They can go a little bit further if they want to. There are all kinds of opportunities and organizations that are out there who need people, people with energy, people with ideas to come in and help them move their causes along.
Yeah, and I would say that, participating in protests, right? Participating in these marches, these rallies that might occur in Los Angeles, right? We know that that's been going on. One has to be careful, right? Of course, because of the authorities and the backlash of those authorities, right? And one has to be aware of those things. But, we have to be, we always have to be aware when we're out in the street somewhere, right? I mean, so be cognizant of that. If one is old enough to register to vote, right? Because like it or not, the ballot box is still what changes things, right? When Professor Campbell was talking about, the changes that have happened in the last few years, right? Those have all been, like these changes that have happened in the Supreme Court, right? That has gutted the Voting Rights Act, right? Well, how did that come about? Because the Supreme Court is appointed by the President of the United States, right? And, and also, Congress, right? Making these laws with, and executive orders and all these other things. So, the ballot box is still going to be very important, right? So one of the things, of course, there's an election coming up, how to get out the vote. It doesn't matter, who you support as much as, getting people out. And not only that, at the local level, right? Making sure that, those local offices, it's not just on the national level, it's going to be on the local level also. Volunteering organizations, right, that you support, right? And also, and these days, right, and that might be dangerous these days, right? One has to be careful, right, because of what's going on with the pandemic. Distributing information for campaigns, or just information about other things, right? Whether it be about food banks, or whether it be about services that may be available to people that need them, that are not aware of them, right? So things like that, right? I think is one way to get involved and to actually create change. In the process of doing that, I think that one learns a lot, and also one sees a lot, and one is able to change one's outlook, perhaps also, and their vision for the future.
I want to also add to that, don't be afraid to start your own thing, because there might be something that's not getting enough attention, or something that's being completely overlooked. So if you could start a movement with a hashtag, if you could start a movement with a Facebook page, I know the kids don't use Facebook anymore, but Instagram page or whatever it is,
TikTok.
like
TikTok.
I was going to say TikTok, but Taco Bell comes to mind first. For the dads, I'm TikToking on a weird thing. Anyway, if you can do that, you would you will touch a lot more people and get more people involved, and also able to follow what it is your plan is, right, and help you move that along. And so I would also say that we have so many young people with so many good ideas, who are really paying close attention to what's going on in the world. And it's a lot easier now to do with social media, I think, even in the era of COVID, because if you don't have to leave your house, you can still do this. If you want to leave your house and you want to go down and join in a protest or help out at some organization, you do it safely, as you know. But I think that getting things off the ground is a lot easier than it ever was before. So now is a really, really good time to do it. And there are some of the people out there who might be watching this video who may want to run for office when they're of age. So don't be afraid to do that, and to get involved in whatever it is, whatever moves you. I think that's just going to be something amazing that, again, I'm going to be optimistic about for the future.
Thank you so much for those suggestions, because we do have a lot of students who are social activists and on fire for this. So it's going to be really interesting next few months to cap off a very surreal year. Dr. Campbell, Dr. Chavez, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's almost exactly an hour at the hour mark. So we appreciate your thoughts, your knowledge, and just helping us to inform our community.
Can I give a quick shout out?
You can.
Please do.
I'd like to give a quick shout out to my friend Chloe Kibness, who is the head athletic trainer.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Chloe.
Nice. And Dr. Chavez, any shout outs on your behalf?
Well, to my good friend Tom Millar, who teaches there at the Marlborough School, who's a great guy.
And I want to thank Tom Millar as well for even bringing this idea to the table. So thank you, Tom, because without his initial suggestion, this wouldn't happen. So thank you again. It's been a real honor to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy. Take care, you guys.
You too. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.